Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of New Books Network. I'm your host, Moteza Hajizadeh from Critical Theory Channel. Today, I'm honored to be speaking with Dr. Ragini Tharoor Srinivasan about a recent book that she's published with Columbia University Press. The book we're going to discuss today is called Overdetermined: How Indian English Literature Becomes Ethnic, Postcolonial, and Anglophone. Dr. Ragini Tharoor Srinivasan is Assistant Professor of English at Rice University. Her books include the essays "What Is We?" published in 2025, and she has also co-edited a book called "Thinking with an Accent Towards a New Object, Method, and Practice" published in 2023. And there is already a podcast on New Books Network about this book, which I encourage you to listen to. Ragini, welcome to New Books Network.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk about the book, Morteza. Thank you.
Thanks. Before we start talking about the book, can you just very briefly introduce yourself, talk about how you became interested in your field of expertise, which is English literature and postcolonialism, and how the idea of this book came to you?
Absolutely. So, as Morteza said, my name is Ragini Tharoor Srinivasan. I'm an English professor at Rice University in Houston, Texas. And this book is essentially a product of 20 years of experience that I had as a student of literature and cultural studies and as a teacher, a professor of literature and cultural studies. I grew up in the Indian American diaspora in the United States. I grew up writing for an Indian American ethnic magazine, and I was always very interested in what I didn't have the language for it as a child, but I was interested in ethnic and diasporic literature and cultural production. And then I went to college. I was at Duke University and I was in the literature department, which was a very unusual place. So it was, literature as opposed to English. It was not exactly comparative literature. Faculty and students were working in something that we might provisionally describe as critical theory and cultural studies. And I just had the incredible experience of being turned on to theory, being introduced to feminist theory and postcolonial theory in particular. And it kind of set me on the path that I am on now. But before I went to graduate school, I went back to the ethnic media and I worked as a magazine editor and a freelance journalist for a couple of years. And that was like an incredible education for me in thinking expansively about audience beyond sort of our traditional academic and scholarly audiences. So I was writing and editing pieces for a wide variety of both Indian and non-Indian, South Asian and non-South Asian, American and non-American readers. And then I went to graduate school and did a PhD in a department of rhetoric at UC Berkeley, which was also, a slightly unusual place. Some listeners might know the rhetoric department. It's not rhetoric as in rhetoric and comp, as we sometimes hear the phrase, but it was a department in which folks were also working kind of broadly in different bodies of theory and cultural production. A close colleague of mine in that department with whom I would later write a pandemic memoir was working on Plato. And I was working on contemporary Asian American and South Asian Anglophone literature. So it was quite an unusual kind of place. All of which is to say, I came out of, literature and rhetoric, and the field in which I was legible was the field of English. So the discipline of English in which I actually had no degrees, and I became an English professor. And so this book that I've written, which is my first academic monograph, Overdetermined: How Indian English Literature Becomes Ethnic, Postcolonial, and Anglophone, this book is really a cultural study of literary studies, and in some sense of American English departments as I have inhabited them and learned from them, and learned specifically through the practice of being an English professor over the last many years. So I said at the top that the book is sort of a product of 20 years of experience. It's a product of and a reflection on my experience in 5 specific research universities. It's a book that uses Indian English literature as a case study, describing it as an object that always appears in the drag of the ethnic, postcolonial, or Anglophone, right? To sort of reference my big wordy subtitle. It's an object that never wears its own name. And so part of the project of this book has been to think about how I have, again, read, studied, written about, transacted, resisted, worked with this quantity, Indian English literature, as an Indian American, as an English professor, as an Anglophone, over the course of the last many years. Maybe a little bit more of an intro.
That was wonderful. Actually, you have, I'm glad because the introduction actually sets the tone beautifully for the book. And you have a lot of wonderful concepts in the book that I'm keen to know more about. And I guess that kind of ties in with the introduction you provided. And one of them is, which I really like, is the idea of accented reading, which is you introduce in your introduction, which is a method of examining text and how identity shapes, production and reception of literature, which I guess echoes, the introduction you mentioned. But I'm interested to know more about that idea of accented reading, what it means, and how it also challenges traditional ways that we approach literary criticism.
No, thank you for that question. So accented reading is absolutely the methodological intervention or contribution of this book. It's something that I'm trying to model. It's not a retrospective description of how I've taught, but it's what I try to produce in every chapter of this book. So I think in order to answer your question, though, let me just back up a little bit. So accented reading is a sort of concept that I try to develop based on work that I've done in collaboration with other scholars, actually who you mentioned at the top, on the concept of accent itself. So if I can just take a few seconds to talk about this, what is accent? An accent is something that everybody has. You have an accent, I have an accent. And yet we, generally speaking, there are ideas about some subjects being accented and others not being accented. We think that accent is a kind of identitarian tell. But actually, what my collaborators and I argue in the book, Thinking with an Accent is actually something that sounds at first as if it marks the identity of a speaker or writer. But in fact, it actually resides in the ear and the eye of the listener or the reader. So accent is, I think, a concept that allows us actually to change the way we think about identity and to intervene in how we understand something like what it means to read difference, or what it means to locate ethnic identity in a text, or geographical specificity in a text. So of course, I spend more time elaborating this in length in the book. But so accented reading then becomes a mode of reading that is not a mode of reading for, quote unquote, the identity of the text, but a mode of reading that attends to the co-creation of the idea of identity. So it's a mode of reading that cues us to the construction of the positions from which we as readers approach text. So maybe if I can even just quote a line from the book, what I call accented reading is not simply a reading of a text. It's not simply a reading of a text, but it's a reading of a relation to a text and an account of a journey with a text, right? A journey sort of toward the text or away from it. So it might all sound a little abstract. So I'll say one more thing. This is a mode of literary discourse analysis that, I think is especially attentive to relationships between readers and writers, and also later, something we can talk about, teachers and students. Because so much of the ways in which, literature that is sort of read under the signs of the ethnic, postcolonial, and Anglophone in sort of U.S. academe, so much of it is read in identitarian terms and in terms of the ways in which writers reject burdens of representation, and the ways in which we scholars also, feel kind of oftentimes embattled by our own identitarian relationships to the text. And so accent and accented reading becomes a way of thinking about relation, thinking about the kind of cross-pollinating relation between writers and readers that, it has a kind of event status and gives us a different way of thinking about how we might want to, or actually already are, approaching literary texts in our work.
I think it's a fascinating. I sort of identify with that as well, because I study English literature myself, and I'm originally from Iran. And people tell me that I have an American accent every now and then. And to me, it became an identitarian thing. I wasn't deliberately trying to mimic that, but I learned my English through classic movies. And studying English literature sort of reinforced that in some people's mind, and it might be a different thing here. I might be taking it to a different direction. But when I was reading the book and the idea of accented reading, it echoed with me that some people assume that I'm deliberately trying to put up this accent to distance myself from my identity, and my act of studying English literature sort of reinforced that idea. And on the other hand, I knew other people, mainly in political department studies, that who were studying, and they deliberately had they deliberately had an accent, not an American or British accent. They had their own accent. They didn't want to pronounce some words correctly because,
Right.
to me, was the idea that accent was resistance, maintaining their own identity. Like I said, it's a different thing a bit here,
Yeah.
but it echoed with me when I was reading the book.
No, it's very related.
Yeah.
No, it's totally related, right? Because, there's a way in which accent, again, we think it's a certain kind of identitarian tell, but it's conscious, it's unconscious, it's performative, it's co-created. And what somebody hears in your voice, right, as an American accent, somebody else is going to hear as an Iranian accent, and somebody else is going to hear as something else. And it tells us as much about the listener as it tells us about you, right? In fact, but what it might tell us about you, or, to quote Lawrence Abu Hamdan, a scholar and artist, it's a kind of biography of migration, right? It's the journey of everything that we have read and heard and watched. And it lives in our voices, right? And so for me as a scholar of English literature and as the writer of this book, I've been wanting to think with that knowledge of accent and its complexity when I read these texts, right, that are called Indian English, right? But what does that mean, right? When I append that name to a text, what do I mean by Indian, right? Like, what do I hear in the voice of the text that reads to me as Indian? And how does the writer, anticipating the way that they're going to be heard, right, try to cue the reading or try to displace the reading or anticipate the reading? Because we're always doing that when we speak and when we read and when we write. We're either approaching our audience or we might even be kind of projecting it. So, what you said is exactly on point.
And I like the idea that, so what does it mean, Indian literature? What does it mean, British literature? I've studied Persian literature, I've studied translations of bits and pieces of Indian literature, Chinese literature, British literature, American literature. And to me, most of the texts that I've read, those great works of literature, are so universal, I can identify with them. There are similar stories in my literature as well. But that label, whether it's Indian, American, British, that already even predisposes you to a specific form of judgment or reading the text in a specific way. Let me ask you another question about the title of the book, Overdetermined. I'm keen to know what it means. What do you mean by overdetermined, and that relationship that a scholar like you, for example, has when it comes to literary fields, especially something like Indian literature, which is a minority literary field in the Anglophone world, and how it shapes your relation to the text of your study when you approach it as an overdetermined scholar. And it would be great if you could unpack that idea.
Absolutely. So so overdetermination in the scholarly discourse, many listeners will know, it sometimes is used in, a Marxist sense, sometimes in a Freudian sense. There are a lot of sort of technical definitions of the term. And I try to say very clearly that I'm using the term overdetermination in order to cue us to its not just colloquial significations, but its rhetorical significations, and also to a specific kind of overdetermination, a kind of multiple causality that follows scholars, a form of overdetermination via what I call, identitarian interpolation. So, okay, that was a lot of big jargony words. So let me back up and say in a different way. When we read ethnic and postcolonial literature, Anglophone literature, what we were just talking about, right? Indian literature, Asian literature, whatever kind of minority discourse or literature in the U.S. Academy, we're very familiar with the idea that the writers of the literature face a burden of representation, right? They are overdetermined by the ethnic and national and sometimes linguistic terms and signs under which they're read. they are burdened by demands to quote unquote represent their communities. They are burdened by the demand for authenticity. They are burdened by demands for a certain kind of fidelity to the reader's understanding of what it means to be something like Indian or African or Asian and so forth. And I think as scholars of ethnic and postcolonial literature, we have actually done a ton of work to understand the burden of representation. But we have done less work, and this is where my book steps in, to understand the kinds of overdetermination that we as scholars, right, ethnic, postcolonial, and Anglophone scholars working on non-Western literature, how do we understand the ways in which we are overdetermined by a kind of identitarian interpolation that demands that we respond to a certain kind of hail from minority literatures in the especially in, and this is the frame of the book, the U.S. academic context. So I use overdetermined and overdetermination as a term with which to revisit what has become, frankly, a very kind of hoary topic in English literary studies, and that's the topic of identity and identity politics. I use overdetermination as a figure with which to think about the move in ethnic and postcolonial literary studies in the U.S., the move towards a kind of post-identitarianism, right? It's very popular, for example, for post-colonialists or let's say Asian Americanists, the two main fields I work in. It's very popular to say, I reject identity, right? It's very popular to make comments like, I don't want to be pejorative. I don't want to be engaged in the acting in doing a research that can be legible as something like me search. It's very popular to say that, I'm not interested in authorial biography. It's very popular to say, well, I'm not studying Indian English literature just because I'm Indian. And all of those things may be true, but they always risk throwing, the kind of bathwater, or what is it, throwing the baby of identity out with the bathwater of bad identity politics. Instead, I think we need to think very seriously about the affordances of identity and specifically of our positions as scholars who are hailed into certain kinds of relationships with texts by something that looks and sounds identitarian, and take that very seriously. I just say two more things about this. I would 100% agree with I think a very sort of commonsensical idea that many of us share, which is, just because you're Indian doesn't mean you know anything about Indian literature. This is of course true, right? And representation does not equal is not necessarily a political advancement. I mean, we have very sophisticated critiques of identity politics for a reason. But there is something specific about the experience of a scholar. And I use my own example and I generalize from it. And I also put it in relationship to other scholars. Ray Chow's work on the protesting ethnic, Gayatri Spivak's coinage about the native informant. I situate my position as a kind of overdetermined scholar in relationship to a lot of these really seminal ideas. The Indian who's working on Indian literature, right, or the Indian American working on Indian English literature does not know anything better about the literature by virtue of their Indianness. But what I'm interested in is the kind of relationship that scholar has to articulate to the object. And one of the ways I describe this is that a scholar who's overdetermined by a certain kind of identitarian correspondence to their object, they don't have to produce proximity to the object the way someone who engages in language study to approach their object does, or the way someone who engages in a certain kind of field work has to produce, proximity to their object. Instead, the overdetermined scholar has to produce a kind of distance from the object. And I'm very interested in this distance, and this distance as a place from which we do and might enact literary studies. Maybe I'll stop there because I'm going to probably start repeating the same thing. But that's it's a kind of thorny subject. I think frankly it's sort of a touchy subject. And in the intro to the book, I describe it as kind of an open secret that we've had a hard time dealing with in literature, I think.
Right. Well, I must say one thing I liked about your book is that it's not purely theoretical. You do discuss a lot of authors and theories as well, and you try to show us your ideas, analyzing their work. And to me, the good thing was that I was not familiar with some of these writers' works, and reading your book has actually prompted me to read their stories as well. And let's talk about one of them that you discussed in chapter 1. Yeah. The multi-ethnic literature. And you discuss, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Bharati Mukherjee or Mukherjee. I'm sorry if I'm butchering.
Mukherjee.
Sorry if I'm butchering the name. You talk about her rejection of ethnic identity and how that reshapes our understanding of multi-ethnic literature, because she has embraced that unhyphenated American identity, and you discuss that through some of her works, such as The Middleman and other stories. Would be great if you could talk about how she, let's say, how she rejects that ethnic identity, what it tells us about the idea of multi-ethnic literature, and how it shows itself. And we don't want to spoil the stories for the listeners who want to read your book and also read this story. And it shows itself in her writing style and also some of the themes in the book. In the book you specifically discuss.
Sure. No, I would love to. I know. I love that. I love that you said, let's not spoil the stories. And so actually, maybe before I talk about Bharati Mukherjee, I'll just very quickly say something about the form of the book, and maybe we'll come back to this later, but I'm going to throw it out there right now. So, so the book, I described it as a cultural study of literary studies. And so on the one hand, the book appears as, in the form of something familiar in literary studies, which is the author-focused monograph. So there are 4 chapters that focus on writers of Indian English literature: Bharati Mukherjee, Chetan Bhagat, Amit Chaudhary, and Jhumpa Lahiri. And I explain at some length why these 4 authors, but just sort of like for shorthand purposes, Bharati Mukherjee is the writer with whom I think about the construction of the ethnic. Chetan Bhagat is the writer with whom I think about the construction of the Anglophone. Amit Chaudhary is the writer with whom I think about the construction of the postcolonial. And Jhumpa Lahiri is the writer with whom I think about the construction of the post-Anglophone. And, and I'm very interested in how these writers, or the ways in which they might help us to rethink or differently understand or specify these categories, and how Indian English literature has been implicated, in their production and in debates about them, right? The book also has 3 chapters that are sort of like short half chapters or interchapters that are about the sort of big 3 post-colonial theorists, Spivak, Baba, and Said. We'll probably talk about them. And then the book also, every chapter is framed by a kind of pedagogical and or institutional situation. So I'll say more about that later, but I say all of that just to say, so the Bharati Mukherjee chapter is about this question of the American accent versus the Indian accent, sort of broadly defined. And now Bharati Mukherjee, who passed away actually just a few years ago, she's kind of considered the seminal Asian American writer. She was considered by many to be sort of the Indian American literary pioneer of her time, sort of writing in the, mid to late, 20th century. She also was an early writer in what is now known as sort of the program era. So she came out of the Iowa Creative Writing Workshop. She also has a PhD. She taught at Berkeley for many years. And, to go to your question, she very famously did not want to be considered an Indian writer. She didn't want to be considered Indian. She didn't want to be considered Indian American. She didn't want to be considered post-colonial. She didn't want to be considered ethnic. She said, I'm an American. And sort of in part because of this sort of a certain kind of assimilationist politics that she had, she's someone who's considered kind of to have bad politics. She's sort of a liberal feminist, an assimilationist. She writes a very particular kinds of immigrant stories. And, she's an interesting character to me because she rejected ethnic identification in order to write her way into the American, the 20th century American literary canon. And she became an Asian American mainstay precisely because of the ways she rejected the field. And so I sort of am interested in thinking about her because I think she complicates our understanding of how something like coercive mimeticism functions, right? And so coercive mimeticism, I'm using Ray Chow's term from The Protestant Ethnic and the Spirit of Capitalism. In Chow's terms, it's a certain kind of imperative to resemble the ethnic self, right? That all ethnic subjects under sort of the conditions of American multiculturalism end up having to perform. And Mukherjee rejects the sort of a certain kind of coercive mimetic imperative, and yet takes on a different and related project of ventriloquizing the American voice. So I explore these topics with reference to a class that I taught on accent, in which Mukherjee figured. And, I have a lot of fun kind of playing with her as someone who invited a certain kind of reading, rejected a certain kind of reading, thinking about, why and when we might want to read her under signs like ethnic and Asian American. So that's kind of what I'm doing with her. Maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that's a good description of her. Like I said, she's quite famous. She was quite famous. She's still famous. Unfortunately, hadn't read anything from her, but I'm encouraged to read more after I've read your chapter. I'm also interested in Spivak. I study English literature, and I'm a huge fan of postcolonial theory, and I've kind of distanced myself from postcolonial theory in more recent years. I've become a little bit critical of that, but I love the foundation of the work that was laid, and of course the work of Spivak as well. To me, this was the most fascinating chapter of the book because Spivak had a lot of influence on me when I was a student. And you discuss your encounters with her. You discuss her as a theorist and also as a symbol, which I really love that description of her. How her presence, her accent, her identity has become this kind of symbolic presence in academia. And you also discuss that her accent is not really just linguistic, but it's ideological. This is a really dense chapter, but I'll leave it to you to give us an idea of what you discussed there and what you mean by her presence as a very famous theorist, postcolonial theorist, who has had an enduring impact and who's still around. What do you mean by her being a symbolic, let's say, presence in academia?
Yes, thank you. So, and very much around. And maybe I can start talking about Spivak by saying that this chapter, this little inter chapter, I call it a recess about Spivak. I could say why in a second. It's called "You Wouldn't Say That to Gayatri Spivak," and I'm sure everything I'm about to say also I wouldn't want to say to Gayatri Spivak. But so I mentioned, I have these little chapters that are about Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, Homi Bhabha, and Edward Said, who, many of you will know Robert J.C. Young called the Holy Trinity of Colonial Discourse Analysis, right? So they're sort of like the big three post-colonial icons. I mean, Morteza, you called them symbols, which I think is very true. And they're very interesting to me. I'll talk about Spivak specifically in a second. The three of them are very interesting to me because, any effort in this historical moment, I think, to reckon with the sort of foundational texts of post-colonial studies, the legacy of post-colonial studies, the problems with post-colonial studies, it's often routed through some relationship to these three major thinkers. And of course, when I say post-colonial, I can put a little asterisk and say I'm still primarily talking about post-colonialism in its American dispensation, because of course, the post-colonial is a sign that reads very differently in different contexts, linguistic, national, and otherwise. And there is not one post-colonial. But since my book is about Indian English literature, I'm thinking about a certain dominant strand of post-colonial literary inquiry, in which Spivak, for example, is absolutely key. And just one more thing before I say something about Spivak, Spivak, Bhabha, and Said, they were symbols and icons and remain so, not just in terms of their work as post-colonialists, even though, I think they all differently rejected the sign of the post-colonial, or, at least complicated it and often rejected it. But Spivak, invites us to rethink questions around academic celebrity. Bhabha invites us to rethink the question of theory and bad writing. And, Said invites us to rethink, public intellectualism, I think. But they all are kind of doing all of that work. So back to Spivak. So Spivak is someone who I think I first really try to think about, the production of her iconicity in a certain kind of afterlife of theory. And I try to wrestle with, what she has come to represent in the U.S. Academy broadly, and then two departments of English in particular. And, maybe I should also say that I do this work in these three little chapters by reading, interviews, paratexts, kind of reading around them, as opposed to, going back and trying to do some original exegesis of Can the Subaltern Speak or something like that. Like, that's not the project of this chapter. It's really to think about the production of iconicity. And, so Spivak in particular, right? If you think about Spivak and Mortaza, I'd be curious, what you think about it, right? But when you think Spivak, you think, can the subaltern speak? And the way that question still, determines and overdetermines the questions we ask in postcolonial studies, right? You think about her disavowal of the postcolonial. You think about the subject position of the native informant. You think about her commitment to multilingualism and to, language learning and a certain commitment to theory. You think about Spivak's kind of charisma and the charisma of these, again, iconic, not just post-colonial theorists, but feminist theorists, queer theorists, right, who were part of staging and performing and enacting the disruptive event of theory, in the 1980s and then in the 1990s. And it was an event. And so for folks like me coming up in the 2000s, we're always already working and writing and reading after that event. And I'm very interested in, maybe this, I don't know if this is unfair, but I think it's become very popular to criticize a figure like Spivak. And there's a lot of frustration with a figure like Spivak, I would say, without naming any names, amongst, colleagues of mine. Frustration, I would say, in the United States right now, in this moment, with some of these iconic figures who, were writing and working, sort of in the heyday of post-structuralism, who were supposed radicals. And we're in this really, really nasty time politically, and people have been asking, well, where are they? At the same time, Spivak has also been criticized, in India, in South Asia, for some of, I tell this story in the book, but, for certain kinds of disciplining and even accent policing, she has done in India. And, she calls herself very self-consciously, I think, and self-critically, she has described herself as a caste and class enemy from abroad when she returns to India, to speak. And so, there's more, without just telling stories, I think I'm very interested. My chapter about Spivak is not a critique of Spivak. It's very much trying to think about, why do we, again, as people reading and writing and learning and teaching and professing after a figure like Spivak, like what lessons did we take from her arrival into the academy? Why does she frustrate us? What did we want from her? And what can she teach us still? And so certainly her commitment, for example, to multilingual pedagogy in this moment in which in the U.S. Academy, language programs are being closed, language literatures are, underfunded, understudied, language requirements are disappearing, humanities programs more generally are embattled, the death of comparative literature that we've been talking about for 25 years, is newly relevant. And so I'm really interested in what we might still learn from her, how departments of English might be able to, be adequate to also Spivak's commitment to rigorous pedagogy. And, I think Spivak's example, among others, is one of the reasons that, my book is, this is not a book about teaching, but every part of this book is also trying to think about and think through teaching in relationship to research, and to think about how teaching and research are always in relation. And that's something that I learned, and I think many people learn from Spivak. So last thing, sorry, I feel like I'm going on too long, but, I'm very interested also, again, as a scholar who came up in the early 2000s and as an English professor in the year 2025, who has an investment in the future, and in a future for literary studies and a future for postcolonial inquiry. I think if we dismiss and get rid of all of our canonical thinkers and teachers and theorists, we will have there will be no foundation on which we can continue to build in the future. So I'm really interested in continuing to think with some of these figures who have been so central to our fields.
You've raised a lot of important points, and I do agree with you. It's I must say, to me, it was refreshing that you have discussed these three authors, Spivak, Homi Bhabha, and Edward Said, because some people say, well, they're just gone, let's just focus on the present. And I've seen a lot of unjust criticism of Spivak, especially on social media. The moment something about her comes out, about even her personal life, I've seen how she's been attacked, and even her famous article, "Can the Subaltern Speak?" is ridiculous, mocked. I'm not familiar with her criticism in India, but I've heard that she's under attack from everywhere. And it just raises the question of why. Why did we expect maybe from that radicalism of post-colonial theory or post-structuralism that maybe didn't come to fruition, and that might be the source of frustration, which again goes to the idea of the role of public intellectual, which is something you discuss in your book through the works of Said. But I do think it's important, as you mentioned, to still engage with the works, with even with their, let's say, symbolic presence in university, because in this day and age, and you explore it in your book, it's so important, especially with the whole idea of the new structure of managerial universities, the new liberal universities, and its emphasis on convenience and product. And I think the Spivak's insistence on multilingualism and that critical reading, it still has something to offer to us. I don't know what you think about this, and it would be good if we could talk about how Spivak can help us resist that new liberalization of education and university, which I guess even in the past 2 years with Trump's attack on academia has even become more significant and important, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. I mean, and 100%, it's not just convenience, as you're saying, 100%, but also efficiency. Here in the U.S. Academy, there's this sort of, what we call a butts in seats model of budgeting that has sort of gone around infecting every university now, where there's all these enrollment pressures. There have, continued to be sort of the intensification of delegitimizing discourses around the humanities education. And of course, it's not just Spivak, but many scholars, including Spivak, who have been trying to think critically and carefully about, again, reading, language, literature, the encounter with the text, right? What is an aesthetic education? Why and how do we think about our own positions as privileged readers and writers, right? In a site like an academic institution that is both the enabling condition of our work and something we also have to resist, right? I mean, these are again, so I think there is a problem amongst, I think, many progressives. I won't name any names, right? But we do a lot of self-flagellation about our sort of like guilt and complicity and this and that. And in this moment, like, there's no time, I think, for self-flagellation and guilt about our positions, right? We need to, from wherever we are, we have to do whatever we can to defend the things that matter to us, right? And as educators and teachers and scholars of English literature, right, like, what matters to me is that the next generations of students, right, are able to have these incredibly rich and rigorous and responsible experiences with text and textuality and the encounters with otherness, the encounters with themselves, the experience of thinking about something like translation. We have to really, I think, defend and fight for books. I mean, of course, all of this is also, I will just admit, to the listener and to you, right? For me, a lot of this now is shadowed in a way by the kind of AI hype and AI discourse that I don't deal with at length in my book, but which I do reference. The book was written before, the last, I would say, especially year of hype. But I think, again, rather than sort of chastising Spivak or, Edward Said, who of course is passed away, over 20 years ago, and others for their positions and for their complicities and so forth, which is part of what they get criticized for. Let's not think about what they failed to do. Let's think about what they, enabled us to ask and what kind of model they set, and the same thing about Homi Bhabha, a different figure who represents something different, but I make a kind of similar argument about him, maybe a little bit less impassioned though.
All right. And I guess that also goes to what I said earlier, because I used to be trying to post-colonial literature. I've become a little bit more critical of it, but I do not deny the importance, the foundational impact people like Spivak, Edward Said had on me, and I do realize the importance of that discourse, what they enable us to do, to give us this critical lens to look at discourse. Let's go to Homi Bhabha. He's another controversial figure who's always been accused of, being too difficult to read, who's been accused of having a horrible style of writing, bad writing, because he wanted to be a poet. I read somewhere at some stage. But anyway, that might account for his bad writing. I don't know. But I must say, from all these three theories that you mentioned, I've read Said the most, and then Homi Bhabha, and then Spivak, and the third is Homi Bhabha. And maybe that's because I've read secondary sources on Homi Bhabha. Maybe I was too much afraid of that style of writing myself. But tell us how those accusations, first of all, why do you think they're still relevant? They still provoke reaction, let's say. And those accusations of bad writing, how do they intersect with the idea of, academic authority, race, gender, in general?
Yeah, totally. No, great questions. And to what you said a little bit earlier, right? And this is the same, when I was discussing this book with potential presses and stuff, and I had some of these conversations, you say a name like Homi Bhabha, and Homi Bhabha, who's still very much alive and working, you say a name like Homi Bhabha, and oftentimes you'll get a kind of eye roll, and people will say, "Oh, is anybody still reading Bhabha? Is anybody still reading? Is anybody still reading him?
Right.
Isn't he kind of done and passé?" And yeah, and I've heard that reaction from people, and in fact, in my book, I was talking about how all the chapters are framed by different institutional and pedagogical situations, and the one that frames the Bhabha chapter, and it's all true. These are all true things. I mean, this book also, if I can just say, there is a kind of principle of radical integrity that in this book, even when I look bad or make myself look bad, it's entirely honest. So anyway, so there's a, I had a graduate student at the University of Arizona where I used to teach who was doing a qualifying exam for his PhD in English literature, and he had a field list in postcolonial theory, and he asked me, "Do I really have to read Bhabha? I don't want to read Bhabha. Bhabha is horrible to read, and don't I kind of already know what Bhabha said about hybridity and mimicry and so forth? Do I really have to read him?" And this it was such an interesting moment because, my instinct was to say, like, yes, of course you have to read him, right? But then the answer is, then the second question I had, of course, for myself was, why am I going to make my student read this text, right? I mean, you have to have a good reason. And, some of it has to do with, I think my investment and interest in all of us who, again, are working after these oppositional knowledge projects from the 80s and 90s, right? That were interventions, that were cannon busters, that were, again, like part of the event of theory. Like, if those texts and those interventions and those books and those authors are part of our foundation, like, it behooves us to make them foundational, right? And to justify their reading. Otherwise, if they're a future for our field. So there's sort of that kind of thing. But then with Bhabha specifically, he's always accused of bad writing, of being very hard to understand. Spivak often is to other scholars, Judith Butler. I mean, many others of them, they won those bad writing contests, which were totally in bad faith, but, back in the day. But I in the book, and, this is kind of to pull out a little bit, I'm very interested in arguments around bad writing and jargon and how it relates to a few different things. So one is, I think some of the frustration with Bhabha, and we sort of, I think, started talking about this already, is that there's this sense that, Bhabha's arguments, for example, about the performative disruptions of the pedagogical, right? Like, they were supposed to be radical. They were supposed to subvert power. They were supposed to be disruptive. And so there's, on the one hand, there's this kind of frustration, like, did theory change the world, or are we like worse off than we were before? So there's this kind of frustration that, again, like, you think about the performative and the pedagogical, we know the careers of the performative, right? It's a kind of concept, and it's frustrating. But it makes us need to ask, again, questions that are absolutely at the heart of literary studies, right? Like, can a text change the world? Can literature change the world, right? What are the politics of textual analysis? And what kind of politics is rooted in textual analysis, right? Like, these are fundamental questions. And I think, engaging again or engaging anew with a figure like Bhabha gives us a chance to re-ask these questions. I also would say that, and this is, I'm generalizing here, but in the U.S. Academy, I think in this moment, and in my experience of it in the last 10 years, there's a kind of fetish, and I know I'm using that word, but there's a kind of fetish for ideas around accessibility and wide address. There's some, been the kind of the rise of the public humanities. There are a lot of criticisms of the humanities that sort of imply that we have not been scientific or scientistic enough. There are a lot of folks in the humanities who feel we need to defend ourselves, and that part of the reason why we can't justify our existence is because we haven't done a good job speaking a language that is intelligible to others. And, I think these are really kind of problematic and interesting arguments, again, that we need to look very closely and critically at. Because if you look at fields, again, like postcolonial theory, where we did try to build up a certain kind of technical vocabulary and a certain kind of armature of discipline-specific argot, we got criticized for being inaccessible. But now, we are at the same time criticized for not being able to defend something like the meaning and value and status of our sort of expert knowledge as knowledge. So, I'm pulling a little clumsily a few threads together, but I'm particularly interested in the book in how Bhabha enables us to ask these kinds of questions. And I remember you said they're absolutely tied up in questions around academic authority, and they're totally racialized and gendered. Yeah. Because of course, again, the question is like who can have or claim authority, and related to that word authority, right, is also this question of expertise, right? What does it mean to be an expert, and an expert in what? We're in this moment right now of, profound de-skilling of educators broadly and humanists specifically, in which, you have these these tech guys running around saying, my LLM has is smarter than a PhD, right? That maybe sounds a little trivial, but if you kind of really think about what that means, it's a really deep devaluation of a certain kind of knowledge. And so how do we articulate humanistic knowledge as knowledge? And how do we defend, something like postcolonial theory or literary theory that maybe didn't exactly change or reshape the world in certain ways that we thought it might? How do we nevertheless account for the tremendous contribution that these texts and books and works and arguments made to the way we think about, for example, race and gender and the distinction between, difference and diversity, right? These were key questions. Just because they're not politically in fashion right now doesn't mean we should dispense with them. We should remember why they were important, and what they were meant to do, not what they didn't achieve.
You're absolutely right. And I guess I think it's perfect time now to talk about Edward Said and the idea of public intellectual and activism, political engagement, because some of these authors that we mentioned, Homi Bhabha or Spivak, despite the fact that all the great writing they've done, they might be accused of just being in the ivory tower and detached. But I don't think that anybody can make that comment about Edward Said. And he wrote about the role of public intellectuals. He performed that role. He was under constant threat when he was teaching at Columbia. His legacy still remains, despite the fact that he passed away more than 20 years ago, as you mentioned earlier. I'm interested to know, what can his legacy teach us about the role of public intellectuals, especially today, that the academia is under threat, that academia is being criticized both from within, legitimate criticism from people who are teaching within, and also from unlegitimate criticism, I feel, from the people who are outside, populist politicians. What can his legacy tell us about the role of public intellectuals and also commitment to political engagement through that academic authority that they had or public intellectuals have?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. You've already sort of like sketched the terrain really beautifully. Edward Said has this really outsized role and reputation, again, in the academic humanities. He is, there are few, you can count them on one hand, maybe sort of these iconic, thinkers and from the world of literary studies, but also more broadly, from the Contemporary Youth Academy, who represent to many of us the ideals of public intellectualism broadly, but then also specifically, the reasons why many of us, and I include you and me, people, and, even though we haven't talked about this, Morteza, if you don't mind, like, why do people like us go to do PhDs, right? Or study literature,
absolutely,
right? I say this in the book, but it's not because, we are trying to, we could go, it's not because we're trying to make money. It's not because we're trying to, become famous. It's not because we're trying to, whatever. I guess I'm trying to decide which profession I should demean here. Maybe I won't. I'll just stay away from that. But the point is, we go, right, because of a commitment to the text, because of a belief in the relationship between the text and the world. We go because we want to maybe speak truth to power. We go because we want to engage with students. We go because we want to have, to have a knowledge to share with the world. And these are all things that Edward Said wrote about, Edward Said talked about, Edward Said modeled, right? A mode of intellectual engagement and public responsibility that was about, you learn what you can and then you present it to the world in some way, right? I mean, that's a kind of crass paraphrase of some things that he said. But whether it's on a podcast, whether it's in a book, whether it's in a journal article, whether it's in a conference, right? We're all, we're doing this work because we feel a responsibility and a desire to learn and share and be in conversation and try to do some good, right? So Saeed is so Saeed, I think, he's iconic for that reason. And then of course, he was always under attack, as you said, because he's was the staunch defender of Palestinian human rights, which of course is a vital topic of this moment. And he was someone who he was called by someone like the bulletproof intellectual, right? He seemed somehow to be able to move between worlds. But in the chapter that I write about him, the little chapter, one of the things I'm interested in kind of putting pressure on is this idea that Edward Said is someone who kind of uniquely or distinctly was able to sort of like combine politics and pedagogy, or sort of marry the world of his scholarship with the world of public intellectualism in a way that others didn't or haven't. Because I think part of what I'm interested in thinking about, with reference to the example of Said, was the way that his public intellectualism was nevertheless in some ways reliant upon the separation of spheres between his public-facing work and his, academic pedagogy and work at Columbia, right? Like in a certain sense, and I'm making this argument somewhat heuristically, but I think those worlds were in certain time, and you could read this in how he talked about himself. They were quite separate. And so in this moment, right, you were asking me, what about the role of the public intellectual today? I think the irony is in this moment, we have a lot of public intellectuals. We actually have a lot of brilliant public-facing, semi-public, articles, arguments, journal issues, books, multimedia presentations. Like, we are not lacking for public intellectualism in this moment. We're not lacking for really brilliant, accessible, beautifully written prose, right? On the model of Said and not on the model of Baba, right? We are not lacking for that kind of work in this moment. But what we are lacking is a profession. What we are dealing with right now is the evisceration of the profession that allowed for a figure like Edward Said to emerge. And what I mean by that is, a profession that actually retains its students, that employs them, with a living wage, with the protections of tenure, with, all of these things. This is the moment and era of, ongoing adjunctification. And we have not, again, speaking kind of in broad terms, as an academy, as a profession, we have not retained and therefore not earned the respect and the fidelity and the loyalty of generations of students who we have trained and dispensed with. And so Said's example, I think, so what I'm kind of learning from Said and what I kind of try to present in the book is, it's not that we all need to be better public intellectuals. I mean, many of us do, and we can think about that. But actually, what kind of profession do we need to be in order to do right by someone like Edward Said and his legacy, right? I guess I would add one more thing, which was that, Said was also a rigorous scholar, right? An expert. I mean, you think of his famous book, Orientalism from 1978, the kind of text of postcolonial studies. It is a product of deep learning and reading and historical research and analysis, right? I mean, it is an expert. It is the production of it is the product of a kind of expertise. And I say it in that way because I think we really have to ask ourselves how and when and why, we articulate a sort of broader aspiration to public address in this moment of not just what I described earlier as de-skilling, but in this moment of a kind of broad disavowal of expertise. Like, I think we as again, people who have been the beneficiaries of, in many cases, doctoral education or higher education, we have to think really carefully and critically and self-critically about what it is we have been given to know and how we can do the best version of that expert work and of that highly trained work and of that scholarly work in order to then, right, know what and how to speak to and for, broader publics.
Yeah, I think it was a perfect answer to the question. Thank you. And I must just confess here that I think I'm not doing justice to the book because in the book, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a nice mix of theory and practice. You talk about some theorists, you talk about some writers as well. We only talked about one writer, but I deliberately chose questions from writers that I was more or less familiar with. So for the last question, I'm going to go back to an author, Jhumpa Lahiri, who's one of the most famous writers. It was, I guess, a few years ago that I heard, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, I don't remember, that I heard that she has started learning Italian.
2012.
So that she can write.
2012,
Yeah.
actually. Or maybe.
Yeah. But I heard that a few years later after that. I think it was in 2015 that I heard that she has started. And like I said, I'm from Iran, and she's hugely popular in Iran. Her books have been translated. I'm not sure about her more recent books, but she's quite well known, even in a country like Iran. And I was really surprised when I heard that she started learning Italian to write in Italian. So I'm keen to know about her turn to Italian and what it tells us about the limits of writing in English for diasporic authors such as Lahiri herself, and that linguistic shift. How does it challenge those expectations of ethnic and post-colonial representation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So Jhumpa Lahiri is a really interesting figure, and I think I mentioned sort of earlier that in the book she represents the post-Anglophone, right? And I mean, and when I say represents, it's all kind of again heuristically and playfully. Yeah. But yeah, so Jhumpa Lahiri, just for those who might not know her work as well, and to underline what you said, another iconic Indian American writer who became famous when her first book, The Interpreter of Maladies, won the Pulitzer Prize in the late 1990s. And her first 4 books were really centered primarily around the Indian American experience, and some might say even more specifically the Bengali American experience that sort of adhered more closely to her own, growing up. So Lahiri, I mean, this I'm speaking again in general terms. In the early 2000s, I think it's fair to say, she was someone who was, to use, my book title, overdetermining the field of Indian American literature. Every writer who wanted to, every, Indian woman writer and it remains to this day who wants to write, fiction. The question is, can they be the next Jhumpa Lahiri? She's someone whose name signifies really powerfully because she came to represent some, a certain kind of Asian American, Indian American, and ethnic writing that was highly celebrated. And yet she herself, and she's written about this, right, was very embattled by what I've earlier described in our conversation as a kind of burden of representation. And she chafed, and she has written about this, she really chafed against certain kinds of demands that she would do a certain kind of writing and be a certain kind of writer and speak to a certain set of experiences that would be legible as, let's say, Indian American experiences. And so very fascinatingly, in 2012, Lahiri moved to Rome with her family, and she essentially reinvented herself as an Italian writer. And she's written about it now in multiple books, in her memoir, In Other Words, most recently in her book of short fiction, Roman Stories. In between, there was a book of essays, Translating Myself and Others. She's written a book of poetry in Italian. She's translated Italian writers. It's this major, big project. And of course, it's not just her project alone, but she's had the benefit of this whole army of, friends and translators and editors and publishers. And there's this whole machinery, right, that operates around Jhumpa Lahiri, the Italian writer. So my book is really interested in thinking about that linguistic shift, and then also thinking about how that shift to date, right, until now, has been received by literary critics. And so I guess I'll flag also for the listener who might be interested, a lot of the chapters of the book, and I'll come back to Lahiri in a second, a lot of my chapters are metacritical, and they're about literary critics, right? And I count myself among them. They're about how and why we read writers the way we do, and also how the writers anticipate the way they're going to be read. So in Lahiri's case, something kind of interesting that happened after she started writing in Italian is, Anglophone literary critics started saying, oh, wow, it's so interesting and refreshing that she has sort of, sloughed off identity questions and sloughed off the post-colonial. She's rejecting, all these things she used to do. And the really profound irony of those kinds of claims, right? Critical claims that, oh, Lahiri has become a new writer and she's not writing about what she used to. She's become a different writer, which also she herself has kind of tried to articulate in some complex ways. The irony is that in Italian, she's telling the exact same stories she was always telling in English, right? Stories of migration and stories of linguistic estrangement and stories of a certain kind of self-formation. But she engineered this kind of return to herself via her own linguistic demolition and return, topically. And it's really interesting to me as a dynamic and as a movement and a kind of itinerary that speaks to every other writer that I'm writing about in this book, and then speaks to my own kind of critical investigation of the way overdetermination works as the enabling condition of a certain kind of scholarship in which you have to sort of leave the self in order to return to the self, right? To say it in kind of like really basic terms. So, Lahiri ends up being this really interesting case, I think, for how we critics and readers, what we think is identitarian, right? What we think was an ethnic text, what we think was a personal text, right? Like just to say one more line about it, Jhumpa Lahiri's Indian American, short stories about Indian Americans, people always asked her, right, if they were autobiographical. And yet the most profoundly autobiographical stuff she's been doing is the stuff that she's doing in Italian, right? Which is this sort of like third space other language that is neither her mother tongue nor the language in which she became, a famous writer. So what is personal? What is identitarian? What is the self? What is, what does it mean to be an Indian writer? I think Lahiri's turn to Italian is a super fascinating case with which we can re-ask all of those questions.
Mm-hmm. You're right. Yeah. I'm going to bring it all to an end with a final question. Your book is a beautiful mix of literary criticism, literary theory, and also reflections on politics and the role of public intellectual, where the section that comes to sight, also in the section you discuss, Spivak. We live in difficult times, as we alluded to. There's a rise of right-wing populists. There's a rise of this kind of even sometimes white supremacist discourse. And there's a lot of anti-minority, anti-immigration discourse all over the world. And it's not only endemic to the United States. There's an attack on humanities. There's an attack on public intellectuals. And I think there was a conference 3 or 4 years ago, the National Conservative Conference, where J.D. Vance, he wasn't the vice president back then, he said, "Professor is the enemy." And he was talking about all this kind of idea of liberal education. Education. So in this day and age, the universities are, like I said, also under attack from within with the whole restructuring and neoliberalization of education. It's a very general question, but I'm keen to know your thoughts. As a word of advice, maybe for our listeners, what is the role of critical reading, literary theory, which is kind of critical theory as well? What is the role of literature in helping us navigate this difficult landscape without, falling into the trap of an identitarian politics either? So how can literature and literary theory provide a way forward to navigate this difficult landscape?
Yeah. No, I think it's a great question. It's a question we have to keep asking ourselves. I mean, maybe if I can start, though, with something you said a little earlier, right? You mentioned J.D. Vance saying the professor is the enemy. I think we take that very seriously. And I'm going to say this in a political way. Okay. So, and, here I'll speak in the U.S. context. Okay. We are the enemy. We are the enemies of the state. We have been declared enemies of the state. I think that's very clarifying. And it's an opportunity, and it's a lesson that many people in many other parts of the world have had to learn long before we did in the United States. And so it's about time that we learned from fellow academics, fellow scholars, fellow public intellectuals, fellow activists, fellow readers and writers around the world about what it means to have been declared enemies of the state in that way that Vance did, even though he was not vice president yet. So I think it's clarifying, and I think it's energizing, and I think we have to, it's an opportunity for us, as you said, to ask ourselves very seriously, what is the value of what we do? But I don't think we do it in a kind of defensive or, as I said earlier, kind of self-flagellating way, because we have to define the terms, right, of our own value. It's not going to be value according to some business speak, ideas of return on investment, right? But we know what we have learned from as thinkers, as readers and writers from the encounter of literature. And, many parts of a lot of the cliches are, they're part true. Right? That part of what we learn is, all the kind of the cliches are about, empathy and the inhabitants of other perspectives and all of this kind of stuff. And, I take seriously criticisms like Namwali Sarpel's of the banality of empathy and everything. But what about the experience of the text? What is writing? What is the relationship between writing and life? What about the text as an opportunity to encounter otherness and alterity, but not just the otherness or alterity of the text, but the otherness and the alterity of the self, right? What about literature as a portal to other worlds, not just of, racial, cultural, national difference, but, to other time periods? What about language, right? As this uniquely, brilliantly, human technology through which we might better understand actually the biggest question of all, maybe what does it mean to be human? And what does it mean to be in relation, right? That's also what literature teaches us it's not always just a solid, you're never reading alone. You're always reading a text that has already been read. Even if you're the second reader, it's always the case that the writer was the first reader, right? You're always in relation when you are with the text. And now more than ever, we have to think about interdependence, and we have to think about community and how to fight for it and create it. I also think, and maybe I'm getting a bit hokey, but I think that's okay, or a bit sentimental or saccharine. But as people who believe in the value of the literature classroom, right? This is the moment to also rethink not just what is the value of literature, but what is the value of the literature classroom, right? Where we can come together to think about how, for example, the text sounds and resounds differently for each of us, and yet provides us a new point of entry into a relationship of togetherness, and provides an occasion for a kind of critical communion, right? Like, I think this is our moment to think about literature, to theorize literature from the classroom, and to not doubt ourselves, those of us who went into this work and world because, maybe it was intuition, maybe it was someone told us, maybe we were just lucky, but because we knew it was going to be a place where we could challenge ourselves and others and learn what it means to be, one of many people in the world. So that's my advice, is that we get energized and we allow this moment to be clarifying, and we do the work that we know we need to do.
Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation and this wonderful answer. I guess you put it beautifully. If you've been declared the enemy of the state, it means you're doing the right thing. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I strongly recommend this book to our listeners.
I think so.
Yeah. Overdetermined, How Indian English Literature Becomes Ethnic, Postcolonial, and Anglophone. And I must say, before we come to the end of the interview, I must say, when I saw the title of the book, I thought it's another post-colonial critique or post-colonial book, but it's not. I do strongly recommend to our listeners. I think I picked up that through our conversation, picked it up that it's way more than that. There is some post-colonial literature in that. There's discussion of that, but it was quite refreshing take, let's say, of post-colonial literature to me, and it was very much conversant with what's happening around the world, and I think that came out in our discussion several times. So I do strongly recommend this beautiful book that was published by Columbia University Press just a couple of months ago. Thank you very much, Ragini, for taking the time to speak with us on New Books Network.
Thank you.